Hello, welcome to the second class. I'm going to discuss the articles regarding the protest that took place by the Wet'suwet'en First Nation in northern British Columbia regarding the proposed building of a pipeline on their traditional territory. So I will share my screen. I hope you are all doing well. Thank you. So, for the first 3 months of 2020, headlines in Canada were dominated by reports of protests in northern British Columbia by members of the Wet'suwet'en First Nation who blockaded a road on their traditional territory. The protest has been ongoing for the last 10 years, ever since a gas company began surveying for the purposes of building a pipeline through the territory, which is in the interior of British Columbia, to the port town of Kitimat for export to Asian and American markets. The conflict escalated as construction was set to begin. Coastal GasLink successfully negotiated an agreement with 5 out of 6 elected band councils of the Wet'suwet'en First Nation, as well as the councils of other First Nations who live along the pipeline route. The company also secured permission from the provincial and federal governments to begin constructing the pipeline, but 8 out of 13 Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs opposed the project. The split between the hereditary chiefs and the elected band councils became the focus of a debate that ensued about who has authority to approve the pipeline. So we'll begin by discussing authority. So in the articles from the syllabus this week, authors talk about authority and the ways that Indigenous nations become recognized as figures of authority. The standoff between the Canadian state and members of the Wet'suwet'en community points to a tension at the heart of struggles over decolonization today, about who has legitimate authority over land development and infrastructure projects on the traditional territories of Indigenous peoples. Does authority reside with Indigenous communities, and if so, who within these communities should have the authority to make such decisions? Should the state have final authority? And this is one of the central questions at the heart of this ongoing conflict regarding the building of pipelines on traditional Indigenous territories. Who is in a position to decide? Who is in a position to judge and then make authoritative decisions regarding supposed economic development or the building of industry on Indigenous territories? So, in political theory, mainstream approaches to understanding political authority ignore the ways in which the concept has been shaped by colonialism. So, this author explores approaches to Indigenous state relations that aim at reforming state authority in response to colonization. They use the resources of these theories to outline 2 different frameworks for how legal and political authority might be decolonized. And these frameworks are referred to as liberal post-colonial statism and relational pluralism. So, firstly, according to a relational pluralist framework, a community can plausibly claim to be a legitimate authority, properly constituted by its members to make decisions over a particular domain. We might hope that outsiders will respect its authority. So, if one constructs a group or is part of a community, they can plausibly claim to be an authority as a community, constituted by its members. And they could make decisions, say, over a certain neighborhood that they live in. And in this case, a certain geographical location or certain traditional territories or lands that they claim authority over or that they are in positions of authority to make decisions about. But unless outsiders recognize this authority, it may not be able to be auth it meaning the community may not be able to authorize the values and pursue the projects for which its authority is constituted. So unless this community gains recognition from outsiders and from the public, they may not be able to then stake their claim to a certain domain. This point is in line with the insightful analysis of Ralph Michaels, who argues that recognition of a legal order is always internal and external. So, in order to claim rights as a community, I have to have internal cohesis, but also external recognition. So, uh, the LGBTQ2S plus community has internal, say, order. There are a specific set of rights that the queer community often argues for: the right to marry, the right to legal recognition, the right to have name changes. And then there has to be external recognition. So the general public and those who are outside of the community have to recognize these claims. With only internal recognition, a legal order can pass law, but may be powerless to enact it over matters other than those that are purely internal to the community. Law can exist but lack authority. Without external recognition, a legal order lacks the authority to act on matters that implicate those outside its boundaries. The requirement of external recognition indicates the manner in which authority is ultimately relational. So, in the previous class, we discussed the case of Bradley Barton, who was accused of murdering and found guilty of murdering Cindy Gladue. In the Ontario courts, Cindy Gladue was referred to as, quote, a native girl, quote, a native prostitute, over 50 times. Cindy Gladue was not referred to as a Cree person. So when we consider the previous examples from last lecture about this naming of Cindy Gladue as, quote, a native prostitute and, quote, a native girl over 50 times without the use of the term Cree woman or Cree person, we can think about this example in relation to the protest at Wet'suwet'en. While the people at Wet'suwet'en see themselves as a community and the allies of Wet'suwet'en and the allies of the Wet'suwet'en Nation, and obviously the Wet'suwet'en Nation itself is a community. But do external actors recognize the Wet'suwet'en Nation? And when external actors do recognize that the Wet'suwet'en Nation is a nation, does this mean that they also recognize their claims to land and their claims to authorize or refuse to authorize the building of pipelines on their land? So this is the essential debate that is discussed in your readings, and uh, this question of authority and recognition and a legitimate claim to make decisions regarding development on land is at the heart of these ongoing protest movements. So these rules regarding internal cohesis and external recognition provide what Nico Krish calls, in the context of international law, an interface by which the authority of one community can be made commensurate with that of another community. Interface rules link complete and different systems of authority to each other for the purposes of enabling them to act where their domains overlap. So if, for example, there is one community like the Wet'suwet'en Nation, their authority and the recognition that they have the right to make decisions regarding the building of pipelines has to be commensurate or the same with another nation, um, and with another Indigenous group of people or community. Interface rules link complete and different systems of authority to each other for the purposes of enabling them to act where their domains overlap. These norms and rules help to constitute the authority of communities that are recognized by their members as legitimately constituted. The notion of interface hints at the reasons why legitimate authorities rely on treaties. Treaties allow the internal authority claimed by one community to be exercised over matters within domains that overlap with another authority. Within the framework of relational pluralism, treaties provide one way to constitute and complete authority. They are the means by which legal orders access authority. So, this interface um, of the authority of one community and the authority of another uh, is expressed in these debates regarding international laws um, of ownership over land. And so, if the Wet'suwet'en Nation owns their traditional lands, then their disagreement with the building of a pipeline existed an interface between the rights of those in business and in the pipeline industry to build pipelines. And obviously, the rights of the Wet'suwet'en Nation exist at an interface with the Canadian state and their legal rights to engage in economic development. Without this recognition, state laws, even those that apply only within state borders, would be violated all the time by other states and transnational actors. This suggests that from a relational perspective, the refusal of one community to recognize another community as having a legitimate legal order indicates not that one legal order is invalid, but instead that its law has no authority for the community that refuses it. So, laws regarding the building of pipelines or construction on land are often determined by secular law and secular English and French law regarding business. So the protests at Wet'suwet'en are expressive of this conflict regarding traditional modes of authority and preservation of land as opposed to business law. When applied within a colonial context, the relational approach to authority suggests that the state has no authority over what counts as law for an Indigenous political order. In this way, relational pluralism maintains space for a plurality of unique legal and political orders, but without external recognition, these orders have no access to authority outside their but without external recognition, these orders have no access to authority outside their boundaries. Norms of external recognition are crucial to all communities that seek to avoid conflict. They have little authority without them. So the norms of external recognition and who is in a position to recognize others is at the heart of questions regarding decolonization. So, as settlers, are we in a position to decide whether we recognize the Wet'suwet'en Nation and their claims to lands? I would argue no, and it becomes offensive from a theoretical perspective regarding or in critical race theory studies, post-colonial studies, to say that settlers are in a position to recognize the claims or the authority of Indigenous nations like the Wet'suwet'en Nation. So within post-colonial theory, the colonizer or colonizers are not in a position to give their recognition or to grant authority. And post-colonial studies often focuses on people who were once or are under colonial rule battling for self-determination. So what post-colonial theorists or critical race theorists would say is that From the standpoint of a colonized people or an oppressed people, self-determination would mean seizing authority over a certain domain, like the names that someone is called, to be called Cree rather than being called, quote, native girl or, quote, native prostitute over 50 times, as was the case of Cindy Gladue, who was murdered by Bradley Barton and referred to by names not of her own choosing in a court of law. So self-determination can be about names, the names that an oppressed people choose to call themselves. And then it is not up to those who are colonizing these people or who are abusing them or trying to murder them to decide what names um, an oppressed people has. So the right to self-determination is also then about the right to names. And this is an example then of how a community can internally decide to call themselves, say, transgender or queer, or to call themselves queer people of color, or to call themselves Sunni Muslims. And so it is not up to those who are external to this group then to give them a name. However, the problem becomes then who is in a position of authority to recognize these names and how do these names become recognized? So if the state does not grant this community of people the legal rights to say use their own name, then this is where protests arise. And there are many examples. Transgender rights, for example, throughout the United States of America have been in the media since the last election. And so the contest or the conflict that often leads to protest is about who is in a position to accept another person's claims, their claims to exist as a community, and then their claims to have a domain over a certain neighborhood, over a certain legal space, over a certain uh, set of religious sites. Colonialism persists in the present day through the framework by which relations of authority between the state and indigenous peoples are understood. Within this framework, states are often criticized for their failures and biases. They are often required to make amends for their unjust pasts. But even this requirement does not by itself challenge the authority states are viewed as vested with. So this problem of authority or the question of authority is really about the state, and the state is still in a position to decide when development can take place and when it cannot take place because of the economy. So the state then has to have control or does have control over economic development. The concern with any statist framework, even one that makes room for different normative orders, is that without challenging how authority is apprehended, post-colonial values can be recognized alongside statist conceptions of authority without the appearance of contradiction. Indigenous rights can be embedded in international and domestic laws, and states can agree to obtain the free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples without this diminishing state authority. As helpful as various measures in place are to ensure against the gross violation of Indigenous rights and to mitigate state power, none of them fundamentally challenges the framework of authority that sustains the state as uniquely positioned to decide how fundamental conflicts ought to be resolved. So, from a Marxist perspective, at the heart of the conflict in Wet'suwet'en, or the conflict regarding the traditional territories of the Wet'suwet'en Nation, is money and economic development. That the state has an interest in the building of pipelines because pipelines will lead to more development and economic growth. And the traditional leaders of Wet'suwet'en or the people of Wet'suwet'en the people of the Wet'suwet'en Nation obviously have an interest in preserving their lands. The Wet'suwet'en people are an Indigenous nation in northwestern British Columbia, Canada, known for their ancestral lands uh, along the Bulky River, their traditional governance system, sorry, sometimes I stutter, hereditary chiefs, and their resistance to the coastal gas link pipeline through their unceded territory, asserting their rights and title and demanding consent for development, as highlighted by the significant 1997 Delgamukkw, sorry, Delgamukkw court case. They speak Wet'suwet'en, a northern Abascan language, and their governance structure predates colonization with 5 clans: Gitdemutun, Gilsahu, Laksilu, Laksamshu, Tseu, having authority over distinct territories, say First Peoples Law, the Office of Wet'suwet'en, and the BC Treaty Commission. So the Wet'suwet'en peoples have asserted their rights and title, and there have been these legal precedents in 1997 regarding their title to land and their right to make uh, authoritative claims over certain domains. So the protests then that happened in 2020 were about these legal precedents and about the existing legal claims that Wet'suwet'en Nation has to their lands. Max Gluckman's work on rituals of rebellion and protest movements has sought to analyze dissent as a process of collision with existing social order, be the end result actual change, resolution and upkeep of status quo, or profound destruction of the opposition. So, from a Marxist perspective, while the Wet'suwet'en Nation has claimed authority and has a name that is recognized in law and a set of legal claims that is recognized in law, this recognition is no longer given when it threatens economic development. And so it is then that these groups, so these nations, must protest. Because while the law exists in writing and in theory alone, when the claims of these groups to be specific nations and to be in claims of authority over lands threatens or potentially threatens economic growth, the state will then move ahead with their plans of economic development. And this has then led to mass protests historically in the history of Canada. The fascination with protest, even if relatively uncommon among the anthropologists, is driven as much by the quest for understanding its reasons and dynamics as it is by the wonder about human aesthetic inventiveness in expressing discontent and coaxing change out of those in power. Further, protests show human ability to see beyond the present circumstances and anticipate what needs changing today. Protests are the site of becoming other than it is now and shift focus to human agency and subjectivity. So many authors have discussed the importance of protests, and protests often highlight the gap between words and practice, between performances or images and material reality. So for Marx, protests are central ways that the revolutionary proletariat actualize itself as a class, and a class that has a sense of consciousness awareness, and determination to bring about revolutionary changes in the class structure. Concentrating on power and performance, the authors consider the matrix within which the protests emerge, the time and space, the historic and social context, framing their performative dimensions and challenging the related hierarchies, creating the in and outsides, communities and outcasts, hidden inclusions and exclusions. Protest worlds are built, and there is meaning and significance for both the participants and the bystanders. Uh, Contributors define protests in a broad sense, following Verda Taylor and Nella Van Dyke's approach of tactical repertoires, in which actual protests are identified as sites of contestation, in which bodies, symbols, identities, practices, and discourses are used to pursue or prevent changes in institutionalized power relations. Understanding the protests as a broad range of intentional practices and discourses driven by their aims allows us to see them as exceptional, intense events where protesters share the actual physical space with their bodies in small or large numbers, but also include periods and presences of relative calm, possibly in the virtual space of awareness and witnessing. Our combination of focuses and cases reveals the expansive and restrictive qualities of protests. The value the contributors place on understanding protests' context, expanding methodologically, theoretically, and empirically beyond the immediate performances of protests, expose effects that protests have on wider social relations. So this is a clip about decolonization.
This presentation will focus on 3 works by Indigenous artists, whose performances are fundamentally political. The central theme that links the works of Paul Laurence Yaxwell-Upton, Adrian Stimson, Terence Houle, and Trevor Freeman is decolonization. Colonization is the establishment of settlements in populated foreign lands through social control by force, whether physical or moral. The most effective tool of colonization in Canada was the Indian Act. Established in 1876, the Indian Act effectively gave the Canadian government the authority to dictate who was and who was not an Indian. The Act covered almost every important aspect of the daily lives of the Aboriginal peoples on reserve. Through the Act, the government imposed control over band membership and prescribed the conditions under which reserve lands could be used and settled. The overall effect was to subject Aboriginal people to the almost unfettered rule of federal bureaucrats. For years, it was exceptionally difficult for Indigenous people to contest this legislation, because the legislation itself prevented them from hiring lawyers. Indigenous people were legally considered wards of the state and were not allowed to vote. Most people believe that once something is colonized, it will not, or rather, cannot be, decolonized. Perhaps this is the reason many dictionaries do not include a definition of the word. Decolonization is a process of struggle whereby colonized nations and peoples reject colonial authority and reestablish freedom. Lawrence Paul is of Coast Salish descent and graduated from the Emily Carr College of Art and Design in British Columbia. He first performed an Indian act shooting the Indian Act in Northumberland, England, on September 14, 1997. Since then, he has performed it in numerous locations across Canada.
That makes me want to ask you about the performance piece that you did, shooting the Indian Act, right? Which you did a few years ago. Talk a little bit about that, because that, for people who don't know it, title, Shooting the Indian Act, is exactly what it was. You shot the Indian Act.
Well, I went over to London. Why London? I mean, we have to go back in history. The Royal Proclamation, the British North American Act, the Constitution, the new Constitution. You know, so when we're talking about totalitarian, capitalistic, imperialistic pigs, I'm talking about the Queen. You know, the cash cow. The, this this cash cow and its imperial regime of the world. And, you know, I really, I think she can bite a cyanide pill as far as I'm concerned about Aboriginal rights in this country and that family and what they've done to Aboriginal people. You know, she can bite really hard. And I think that that's what my feelings about the Indian Act is, that it was such a racist white supremacy act of Canada. They have the wrong title for it. Canada has to fess up to its white supremacy. You don't need the Ku Klux Klan and United States flag and waving their shit all over the place. I mean, you guys have Harper. You guys have, John Chrétien, the White Paper Policy in 1969. Abolish all reservations, assimilate all Indians. Harper probably has John Chrétien on his speed dial. We got to take care of those Indians. The Indian problem.
This raises the timeless question: can art promote political change? Lawrence Paul is extremely politically motivated. An Indian Act shooting the Indian Act can be read as a clear act of defiance against the colonial power of Canada.
You can live under the Indian Act and be one of those Indian Act Indians, but I'm not. I am a First Nations person on my traditional territory. This is my land. And nobody is going to stop me from saying anything. I will exercise my human right as a person. I don't need Greenpeace. I don't need David Suzuki. I can speak for myself, and I am.
Bertolt Brecht argues that art is not a mirror to reflect the world, but a hammer with which to shape it. He implies that art's primary function is to change the world. Adrian Stimson has chosen art over politics as the vehicle for his political ideas. Before becoming an artist, he was involved in Indigenous politics for 8 years. Stimson is a member of the Blackfoot Nation and has an MFA from the University of Saskatchewan. Stimson is best known for his multifaceted character, Buffalo Boy. All of Buffalo Boy's personas are extreme and over the top. One of the personas sports a bison G-string, buffalo corset, and a disco cowboy hat, and plays with the crossing of boundaries between genders. Another persona appears as a mystical shaman. Covered in buffalo fur, this shaman stalks around, creating a threatening feeling. Adrian Stimson's fabulous and fictitious character of Buffalo Boy is free to shift in and out of identities, abandoning fixed meaning in favor of play, indeterminacy, and ambiguity. Stimson's constant shifting between personas makes it impossible for audience members to pinpoint his identity. For centuries, the identities of Indigenous people in Canada have been determined for them by outside powers. Stimson confronts the audience with their own prejudices. His personas are so extravagant that they push the boundaries of what is comfortable. Terence Hoole is a member of the Blood Nation. Hoole was brought up to believe that it is possible for both Indigenous cultures and Western cultures to exist in harmony. Trevor Freeman is a Métis artist and has a BFA from the University of Lethbridge. Portage, a collaboration between Hoole and Freeman, was first performed in Vancouver on October 24, 2007. During the performance, Hoole and Freeman carry a 16-foot canoe through the city, dressed in the traditional clothing of their respective Indigenous cultures. The performance usually lasts 2 to 3 hours. Along the way, they interact with people and occasionally stop to talk, eat, or rest.
I have a complaint.
Michel de Certeau argues that as they walk, pedestrians write the city. As Hoole and Freeman portage through the city, they rewrite the story of the city to include their Indigenous cultures. The performance suggests that Indigenous cultures have in fact not been completely lost and have not been successfully assimilated. The artists present this truth in a humorous way. Hoole and Freeman are making an effort to revitalize their culture. Decolonization was described as a process of struggle by which colonized peoples reject colonial authority and reestablish freedom. Although they accomplish it in different ways, Shooting the Indian Act, Buffalo Boy, and Portage reject colonial authority and resist cultural assimilation. Paul Lawrence does this by literally shooting copies of the Indian Act, repeatedly assassinating the metaphorical body of the British Crown. Adrian Stimson's multi-gendered Buffalo Boy, neither human nor beast, neither boy nor girl, rejects the colonial identity norms. Hoole and Freeman use the absurd act of portaging through the city to reclaim the space. Their humorous performance offers hope that Indigenous cultures and Western cultures can coexist.
So decolonization requires rebuilding indigenous legal and political orders that have been damaged or destroyed by colonialism. And authors seek to show how authority is conceptualized and apprehended, and this is also crucial to decolonization. So conventional statist frameworks of authority can render invisible indigenous and political legal orders and distort the practices and actions that inform these orders. Laws become mere interests, community division becomes dysfunction or evidence of assimilation. Protests become defiance, solutions remain temporary. A statist framework, even one informed by post-colonial values, highlights demands for the state to direct processes more fairly and often in ways that recognize the distinctive values and interests of Indigenous peoples. Within a liberal post-colonial statist framework, different normative orders must be somehow coordinated. Instruments of international law can help by boosting the political power of Indigenous communities, amplifying Indigenous demands, exposing the bad behavior of states, and drawing into question the legitimacy of state decision-making that excludes Indigenous input. But the state remains the final broker. So protest creates a space of dissent. And the protests that were staged by the Wet'suwet'en Nation created this space of debate and dissent regarding authority. Protests expand beyond the topics and ideological or realm-specific borders. They are also capable of expanding in space. On the surface, exceptional events occupy space exceptionally. For a time, places with no immediately obvious political alignments take on new meaning. So the space of a traditional Indigenous territory can take on this meaning as a site of protests. And this is also true of artists who occupy city streets, like the portage performance and protests that were described in the previous video. Streets and squares with or without a history of protests filled with people, opinions, and banners will with a desire for change. Emotions until now confined to private spaces and qualms, expressed in close circles, are brought out into the open. Opposition between protesters' approaches or with state and public unfold not only in discursive but also physical space. Obtaining presence in physical space is the ultimate test of exceptionality. The dissenting idea escapes into the open, pours onto the streets, shakes the society, brings trouble to the authorities. The spatial presence of protests is very intense, triggering also keen interest from the anthropological and political studies of protests. These protests are, in fact, not only about expansion of protestable space to everywhere the protesters can reach, in this case within the national borders affected by the changes in practices, traditions, and law, but simultaneously a type of protection of space, as protesters demand the forest cover and its veiling cover, sorry, as protesters demand the forest cover and its availability to diverse wildlife stay intact. So the protests that are described are those in forests where the protesters are demanding that the sanctity of the land and its wildlife remain preserved against bids for economic development. This protection of space may express a fear of expansion, a process always capable of exclusion, of invasion, destruction, contamination, and capture by forces and bodies, institutions, and developments that are seen as dangerous. The anti-logging protesters lament the change beyond recognition of forests as shared space across the country, brought on by permissive laws and invasive forestry practices. Avery describes fears that the planned Disability Justice Center would contaminate the space of the already stretched neighborhood, turning it into the quote dumping ground, evoking danger and insecurity. Protesters stand in between these future developments and the endangered spaces and may approach it through conflating rather than inflating in space. Their aim, as Avery demonstrates, may be simultaneously to keep people out of the protected space and to keep them in their place. In Estonia, the hated heavy machinery and destructive mentality of the loggers is to be kept out of the forests, confined by law and regulations. In doing so, the protests draw the spatial borders of their interests. Whether or not protests explicitly call for the recognition of certain universal aims, all protests are about grievances and the right of these grievances to be recognized and to have an impact in the society. It is for this aim, ultimately for achieving change, that people come together in protests. As such, all protests are clearly about power, more precisely about tilting the balance towards groups and/or issues previously neglected or ignored. While many studies consider power in protests, most famously perhaps James Scott discusses the ways that protests are logically seen as a contest between two parties, with one holding, at least initially, greater and the other protesters less power. It is this setup that creates the particular kind of tension characteristic to all protests. So, protests are ultimately about power and who has power to make certain authorial claims over certain domains. Protests also extend in time beyond the exceptional moments of performative events as they are repeated or sprawl out from the original protest. With reference to the future as well as the past, protests are moments of struggle in between the past and its accessories, such as identities, either revered or problematic, and the future, anticipated to be in some way unacceptable or disappointing without the protesters' demands being met. This continuity in time is not only empowering, however, and can disempower the exhausted protesters as change fails to materialize and as examples of the continuing problem keep on coming. Witnessing the continuation of protestable issues drains the protesters their hope and the trust in the existing structures and mechanisms, including democracy itself. It is such continuity that forces the protesters as as witnesses to define, reconcile, or antagonize the past or the relevant identities. Ultimately controversial, protests often remain limited in their ability to embrace all affected groups and interested individuals, either because their contributions are awkward or they themselves feel awkward because of financial interests, because the exclusion itself is the whole point of the protest, or because certain groups are so invisible that even highly relevant struggles they could contribute into the protest movement are left unused. So these authors discuss protests at Attawapiskat that took place between 2012 and 2013. So during this year, tens of thousands of Indigenous peoples and their allies gathered at busy downtown intersections, remote reserves, shopping malls, and highways all across Canada to participate in flash mob, round dances, rallies, and prayer circles. Their stated goal was to promote Indigenous self-determination and protect the environment. At the same time, Chief Teresa Spence of the Attawapiskat First Nation in Northern Ontario declared a hunger strike to raise awareness of her people's third world living conditions and call on Canada to honor its nation-to-nation treaties. For months, such events known together as the Idle No More movement dominated Canadian news media and gained international attention and support. While some non-Indigenous Canadians joined the movement, others grew frustrated and the federal government refused to meet the protesters' demands. So this is a clip about Attawapiskat.
Staff, our Minister of Health is engaged directly on that issue. We're following with our hearts going out to the families.
This isn't just but particularly about Attawapiskat. This is about who we are as Canadians and our whole nation.
Listening to the words of despair out of many of the youth in Attawapiskat. Government promised to implement the Truth and Reconciliation recommendations in its entirety.
We know this crisis has been happening and there's no new augmented funds.
I acknowledge that clearly we have not done enough.
2 months later, have they forgotten? Is there nothing there?
That's an issue of political will that we could change tonight.
There's no question that things like housing and water and infrastructure, youth centers is also very much part of a way forward in terms of hope and opportunity that we know the young people are looking for.
This is the beginning of a new era, not just for Attawapiskat, but for relationships with First Nations across the country. Merci beaucoup.
They lost hope too. They're waiting for that youth center to be opened.
I don't believe we'll ever see a permanent youth center.
There was a commitment made and it's taking longer than what was anticipated.
It's a fact, it's a social fact, like what's happening in some Native communities with youth, you know. So what we do here, like besides doing art, sometimes we'll do a presentation, a lecture, like a medicine we're teaching, give them some critical theory so that they can analyze what's happening. For Attawapiskat, they're preparing to open up their temporary shopping center. Almost looks like it's going to be done soon. So we're just here helping out, like before something is happening, that we provide a space for the youth.
Back in my age, well, I had a drug addiction, so what would have been normal was like just going doing drugs around here.
What were you addicted to?
Speed, mainly, firstly weed. I moved on to speed, meth, and then I started doing gas, huffing gas. Living young, living live, living free. The friends I hang out with are younger, so I try to encourage them not to do it. I try to stay away from that so they don't get fall into that kind of thing there.
Is it easy to stay away from?
No, it's like after years of doing that, all you did was get high. When you don't do that no more, it's like, what else do you do? I think it's getting better here, and especially with the youth center, it made me happy that there's a youth will have somewhere to go. Yeah, something to do other than drugs and all that.
Oh no, I guess they just don't have enough activities here. I mean, they're building that youth center, but it's for the kids. I don't know, these people just need more activities in this town because they barely do anything here. Every time I'm on Facebook, I always see these depressed quotes, statuses. Oh no, there's nothing really in this town, like nothing fun for the kids.
Well, I think that one of the challenges when you look at our community is the tendency to look at issues in isolation and making judgments based upon that. However, the situation on the ground in Attawapiskat is much more complex. Every issue is interrelated. For example, the issue of housing. How does it impact health? How does it impact education? Infrastructure, similar set of criteria. How does that impact your houses? How does that impact people's quality of life? Right now, the temporary youth center probably has another month and a half of construction left. So it's going to come up pretty close to the second anniversary of the declaration of emergency. The permanent youth center, currently we're engaged in discussions with Ontario regional officials as to how to implement this. And that's been one of the challenges. We've conducted a consultation exercise with the community youth. It was an exercise that went and directly talked to the youth. And the youth spoke. They gave a very clear indication of what they wanted to see in that building. They wanted to basically restore a cultural to the community by having this facility built. Now, the challenge that we all have to have is how do we take those aspirations and make them come into concrete reality? There was a commitment made, and it's taking longer than what was anticipated. The basic infrastructure of the community was built in 2000 when water and sewer was made available to all of our community residences. Our current water capacity, both treatment and sewage, is pretty much either at capacity or over capacity. We also have a community that's atypical. We have a housing density approaching 7. as opposed to a typical water consumption pattern where you have 2 or 3 people taking a shower or doing household laundry or cleaning. That's multiplied by a factor of 2 or 3.
We have rashes. My youngest daughter has rashes all over her body. And we have dry coughs and headaches most of the time. And then I don't know, just irritations in our body. It's very hard to live in this environment. I just can't wait to move out of here. There's 5 of us, 2 of my daughters and my son-in-law, and my husband and myself in our dog.
Rot, just rotting away.
It really affect the lives of everybody, especially in the crowded houses. Students can't function, they can't study. I work in the school, I work with the students. I'm the female counselor at Fisher Secondary School. That's one of the things that major issues that they face, crowded housing and moldy housing. I think the government should do something about it, not to lie to us anymore. They say that they're gonna fund more, they're gonna put more funding into housing, but it's not so. Otherwise, I wouldn't be living in this environment right now, living in a condemned house.
Depending on which houses you want to look at, yeah, things are getting worse. As in population growth, the overcrowding is increasing yearly. And yeah, things are not getting any easier. It's hard to maintain existing housing stock as well. And even with the new homes coming in, each time a house comes in, we already have like 20 other families waiting for one. Just to alleviate the pressures of overcrowding, it would take 130 houses.
It's not just fly in and have these crisis workers coming into the community, and that hasn't resolved anything. In fact, that has made matters worse. When the crisis started, they dropped in all these crisis counselors from all over the place. And they came in, and actually they're still doing that right now. They come into the communities and they counsel or try to de-escalate the crisis. That's fine. And then they leave. So you've opened up all these people, all their pain, all their grief, and there's nothing there for them. There's no follow-up. These people come in like once a month, maybe. They give 1 hour to a client, and then they're gone. In a person's lifetime in this community, they will have seen 50 doctors. And one doctor will diagnose something in a patient, and then they'll be gone for a week or so, a month maybe, and the patient goes back to the hospital, and it's a different doctor. So the doctor assesses the person again, and then says, oh no, that is not your diagnosis. So this is a different type of treatment. And this goes on and on and on for years and years. So there is no way for anybody to do anything else. You have to see the doctor that's there. That you have no choice. We're still in a state of crisis. We're just risk managing it right now.
All right, let's do High Road. It's the name of the first song. High Road. High Road. It's the name of the album too. It's a song about taking the high road, right? And it's really about my relationship with Attawapskat in the last 5 years, I guess. My dysfunctional relationship. I gave you my best every day. You wore me down. Was it all a test? I don't know. I wanna leave this town and never look back, never look back, ever. That's a good question. I ask myself that all the time. What am I doing here? Yeah. Part of me, I always felt was still pretty wild. Like I feel wild and free, being here. And if I go out, and to go be on the land, no one will bother me or will say anything. I just go and I enjoy it. I enjoy this beautiful place that we have and all the rivers and the bay and everything that there is here. Things I've done, you should know. I think the biggest issue is our community spirit is broken. How do we get our mojo back? How can we start to come together and gather and just really enjoy one another's company and be happy together as a community. I'm moving on up, I could see the top. I don't think that the answers with the government. I think the answers lie here in the communities, in our communities, and we need to find a way to fix what's been broken. I'd like to also think that our young people are going to really rise up and begin to change this place. And I think that's where the hope is. And inside me, just look how far I've come. Lord, it tells you to alleviate all the things I stood for. I chose to take that high.
Well, let's talk more about that.
So, relationships between Indigenous peoples and settlers in Canada have changed dramatically over time, and authors distinguish four historical periods. Firstly, before the arrival of Europeans, dozens of independent Indigenous nations existed in what is now Canada. From French explorer Jacques Cartier's voyage to Quebec in the 1530s until the 1800s, Indigenous and European nations often formed commercial partnerships and military alliances, yet conflict also occurred. Eventually, Euro-Canadian settlers turned to coercive means to displace Indigenous peoples from their lands and assimilate them to the lower rungs of settler society. Since World War II, and especially since the 60s, Indigenous peoples across Canada have collectively mobilized to assert their rights and demand fair treatment, resulting in ongoing confrontation and resistance, but also negotiation, healing, and renewal. The 1867 British North American Act set the legal framework for Canadian nationhood. It assigned jurisdiction over Indians and lands reserved for Indians to the federal government. Yet even earlier, laws and policies were enacted to control Indigenous peoples. Most of this legislation was combined and strengthened in the 1876 Indian Act, which purported to define who was and was not Indian and designated all Indians as, quote, wards of the state. It encouraged Indigenous men to renounce their Indian status, become British citizens, and obtain private property to be taken from reserved land if they were judged to be educated, debt-free, and of good moral character. The legislation also denied Indian status to Indigenous women who married non-status men and to any Indigenous person who obtained a university degree. It established the Bound Council system, undermining traditional governments, and enabling the federal government to veto banned legislation and dispose Indian chiefs. Subsequent legislation allowed municipalities and corporations to expropriate reserved lands for roads, railways, and other public works, authorized judges to move entire reserves if expedient, banned Indigenous people from selling agricultural produce, and prohibited First Nations from hiring lawyers to pursue land claims. And we've discussed the ways that media often shapes perception of Indigenous peoples in racist ways. In the contemporary era, stereotypes of the drunken conquered Indian remain widespread. Many non-Indigenous Canadians feel sympathy for Indigenous peoples and want to, quote, help. Yet this image of dependency coexists with others. In times of unrest, many settler Canadians endorse stereotypes of the angry protester who is allegedly dangerous and unpredictable, a threat to Canadians' peaceful way of life. Others complain about, quote, welfare bums and, quote, corrupt Indian chiefs who allegedly exploit the system and receive unfair advantages at taxpayers' expense. Still, other Canadians throughout history and perhaps increasingly today have viewed Indigenous people as fellow human beings and treaty partners, though whose traditional knowledge and skills may help us all overcome societal challenges such as climate change. Of course, Indigenous peoples' perception of newcomers have also varied across time and place, ranging from potential friends and allies to the conveyors of war and disease to ignorant, selfish, greedy people whose way of life is destroying Mother Earth. These images also reflect Indigenous peoples' needs, interests, and experience with settlers. So, there is a great deal of terminology in understanding Indigenous self-determination and decolonization. So Métis is a term that is recognized in the Canadian Constitution. And in French, the term translates to, quote, mixed race or, quote, half-blood. But the Métis National Council, the national political organization representing Métis people, rejects this racial definition. From their perspective, the Métis are a distinct nation. To qualify as a member, one must not only self-identify, but also trace one's lineage to a historical Métis settlement in central or western Canada, where the children of European, usually French or Scottish fur traders, and Indigenous, usually Cree or Anishinaabe women, often developed their own communities with their own hybrid language, customs, laws, and governments. One must also be accepted by the contemporary Métis Nation. The Congress of Aboriginal Peoples, which represents off-reserve Aboriginal peoples, prefers a looser definition, including virtually anyone of mixed descent who identifies as Métis. The Inuit are the third group of Indigenous peoples recognized in the Constitution. Speaking a variety of dialects and practicing distinct cultures, they are the Indigenous peoples of the far north, spread out across 4 regions: Nunatatsviat in northern Labrador, Nunavik in northern Quebec, Nunavut, a large territory created in 1999, and Inuvialuit in the Northwest Territories. Nationally, the Inuit are represented by the Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami. So Inuvialuit in the Northwest Territories. And they are represented by the Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami. In Inuktitut, Inuit means the people. Until recently, the Canadian government called them Eskimos, an Algonquin term meaning raw meat eaters that many considered offensive. Traditionally, the Inuit were semi-nomadic subsistence hunters and fishers. Contact with non-Indigenous people began as early as the 16th century for some, and as late as the 20th century for other commentators. After Federation, the Inuit was placed under the Indian Act. and they were later removed but still considered under federal jurisdiction. To track the Inuit population, the RCMP forced Inuk individuals to wear discs around their necks containing code numbers for family names and homes of residence. The disc system was ended in 1971. Today, the federal government accepts self-identification. So this kind of marking of the Inuit with this system of discs that were hung around their neck with numbers is reminiscent of slavery, the marking of slaves through numbers, and the Holocaust as well. So these kind of uses of marking of Indigenous peoples' actual bodies with numbers gestures to the genocidal nature of Canada's ongoing white settler project. Social inequalities have been documented by every commentator who has looked at Indigenous issues, including the United Nations. In October 2011, Attawapiskat First Nation, a fly-in community 500 kilometers north of Timmins, Ontario, declared a state of emergency because dozens of families were living in uninsulated sheds, tents, and donated construction trailers with no running water. The unemployment rate was above 60%. The community had been without a proper school since 2000. Yet just 90 kilometers west sat the richest diamond mine in North America, and virtually every conventional indicator of social well-being, Indigenous peoples fare worse than settler Canadians. This section outlines some of the persistent socioeconomic, health, and other inequalities between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in Canada. So the diamond mine, as juxtaposed to the poverty of Indigenous peoples, is similar to the mining of diamonds in colonized or formerly colonized countries in Africa and the poverty of formerly colonized peoples globally. Overall, Canada is often rated as one of the best countries to live in. According to the United Nations, Canada has the 8th highest quality of life in the world. If Canada's Indigenous peoples formed a separate country, however, they would rank 63rd, around the same rank as Lebanon and Malaysia. Most Canadians take clean drinking water for granted. Yet across Canada, as of 2018, 75 First Nation communities, 12%, have had boil water advisories for more than a year. Some reserves have not enjoyed potable water for decades. Entire communities, such as the Kashechewan First Nation in Northern Ontario, have been temporarily evacuated due to inadequate water or sewage services, which is similar to countries like India and Bangladesh. And the water quality and the water issues are similar to countries in the global south. Compared to non-Indigenous Canadians, Indigenous people are more than twice as likely to be unemployed. Among those who are employed, Indigenous people's median income is about 60% of the national average. First Nations families are nearly 3 times more likely than other Canadian families are to be below Canada's low income cutoff after taxes and transfers, and about 50% of First Nations children live below the low income cutoff. Nearly 1 in 5 Indigenous peoples live in homes defined by Statistics Canada as overcrowded, compared to only 2% of non-Indigenous Canadians. 40% of on-reserve dwellings require major repairs, compared to only 6% of off-reserve Canadian homes. In terms of education, the high school dropout rate among Indigenous youth is 23%, 2.5 times the national average. A First Nations boy in Manitoba is more likely to end up in prison than to graduate from high school. Non-Indigenous Canadians are nearly 3 times more likely than Indigenous people are to have a university degree. In brief, Indigenous peoples' well-being has been undermined by colonization. Underfunding, the imposition of restrictive laws and policies, the forcible removal of Indigenous peoples from their lands, the destruction of traditional economies, coercive assimilation, historical trauma, and ongoing racism and stereotype have created huge gaps in wealth, income, education, housing, and health between Indigenous peoples and settler Canadians. So the Indian Act is discussed in several of the interviews with Indigenous peoples in Attawapiskat and Wet'suwet'en. The Indian Act disempowered First Nations and constrained their economies. The very existence of the reserve system is such a constraint. The cost of doing business on reserve is up to 6 times higher than it is off reserve, partly due to the remote location of many communities, which drives up transportation costs and limits access to markets. The Indian Act restrictions worsen the situation. Since individuals cannot own private property on reserves, First Nations cannot use their land as collateral to secure financing for economic development projects. Some scholarly and policy advisors promote individual property ownership on reserve. However, this approach violates the tradition of collective land stewardship in many Indigenous communities and creates the long-term risk of losing the Indigenous land base altogether through land sales to non-Indigenous peoples and corporations. Some reserves are located in urban areas, and some of them have initiated economic development projects that have created good jobs and considerable wealth. However, many First Nations do not own urban reserves, and some non-Indigenous governments have prevented them from obtaining urban real estate as part of land settlement claims. Historical trauma is central to genocide. Other theories of inequality emphasize historical trauma, which occurs when, quote, the consequences of numerous and sustained attacks against a group accumulate over generations and interact with stressors to undermine collective well-being. In the case of Indigenous peoples, the history of land theft, enforced relocations, broken treaty promises, residential schools, and other coercive assimilation policies has undermined not only their political power and economic well-being, but also their psychological health. The effects of such trauma include violence, addictive behaviors, mental illness, and suicide. For example, studies with Indigenous peoples on and off reserve show that residential school survivors have poorer physical and mental health than to other Indigenous peoples. Finally, I'll finish by discussing violence against women, which we talked about in last week's lectures regarding the murder of Cindy Gladue. Beyond socioeconomic conditions, gender strongly shapes the experiences and life chances of Indigenous peoples. In May 2014, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police reported that 1,181 Indigenous women have been murdered or gone missing in Canada in the past 3 decades. Although Indigenous women comprise 4.3% of the female population, they account for 16% of female homicides and 11.3% of missing women. Since 1980, the overall rate of female homicide has decreased, but the rate for Indigenous women has increased. From a sociological perspective, this problem is rooted in historical and ongoing processes of colonialism, racism, and sexism, which have marginalized Indigenous women and encouraged many Indigenous and non-Indigenous men to believe that violence against Indigenous women is normal and justified. Historically, most Indigenous societies were more egalitarian than European societies were. Under Christian patriarchy, the ideal European woman was pious, submissive, and domestic. Many Indigenous women had far more power and independence. They often served as spiritual, political, and military leaders, had the right to divorce, and controlled their own sexuality and the allocation of household resources. Although there was a gendered division of labor, gender roles were not rigidly fixed, and men's and women's work was equally valued. Violence against women was rare, and perpetrators were severely punished. Many European men viewed Indigenous women's autonomy as a threat to their power and a negative influence on European women. They further realized that to secure control on Indigenous lands, they had to subjugate Indigenous women. Thus, European missionaries promoted patriarchal gender roles and physical punishment of non-compliant women to maintain a strict gender hierarchy. Indigenous women's leadership has always been existent prior to colonial contact and even after colonization, despite threats to Indigenous women's political authority. Despite facing many severe challenges, Indigenous women have often led the resistance to colonization and the resurgence of their communities and cultures. Moreover, gender inequality within Indigenous communities is on some measures less extreme than within settler communities. According to the 2012 report by the National Indigenous Economic Development Board, there's a small gap between Indigenous men and women than between non-Indigenous men and women in labor force participation, wages, and entrepreneurship. Indigenous women attain undergraduate degrees at more than twice the rate of Indigenous men, and Indigenous women with university degrees earn more than their Indigenous female counterparts. In 2011, 17.5% of First Nations chiefs were women, slightly higher than the percentage of female mayors in Canada. Many female chiefs have successfully addressed social issues, negotiated with outside parties, managed budgets, and improved community health and well-being. Beyond elected leadership, Indigenous women play pivotal roles at the grassroots level. 4 Saskatchewan women, 3 of them Indigenous, founded the Idle No More movement. In December 2002, a small group of women and youth at Grassy Narrows First Nation started the longest-running blockade in Canadian history to halt the unauthorized clear-cutting of their lands. Indigenous women have also been leading in other resistance actions from the Oka standoff to ongoing anti-pipe activism in Alberta and BC. So I'll finish by playing this clip about Indigenous feminists and Indigenous feminist art in Canada. And the clip is called A Monumental Voice for Indigenous Art, and it involves interviews with Indigenous
The Monumental
artists.
Is the name of a major exhibition by the award-winning visual artist Rebecca Belmore. It is one of the summer's major offerings coming out of the Art Gallery of Ontario's new Department of Indigenous and Canadian Art. It captures the long view of Rebecca Belmore's works from the past 30 years, where she's given voice and power to some of the most pressing issues of the day. Also joining us, the AGO curator who coordinated the exhibit, Wanda Nanabush. Welcome to you both. It's nice to see you.
Thank you for having us here.
We can relax and talk for another half hour about Indigenous art. Wanda, even before you took the job as curator of Indigenous art, you were working on a project to rehang some of the gallery's art. Can you tell us about that project, please?
Sure. We've done a few things, but right now we've renamed the McLean Center for Indigenous and Canadian Art. And it has...
Why is that significant?
Well, it's always been Canadian art. So Indigenous hasn't really had its own place or a significant place in the department or in the galleries. So now we have a brand new Indigenous art gallery opening, as well as all the other galleries have Indigenous contemporary art in them. And the Indigenous contemporary art sort of starts the conversation, and we bring in the Canadian art to kind of have a conversation with the Indigenous art. So,
and that project that you were working on before?
It was to switch the kind of thinking around Indigenous art from one that is chronological to one that deals with two things I think Canadians have trouble dealing with, which is land rights and real living Indigenous people that are contemporary today. So that was the kind of shift we made.
And Rebecca, you were a student at OCAD in the 80s. How has the AGO's approach to Indigenous art changed since then?
Well, I think it's changed drastically because when I was a student, right next door to the AGO, and I would go and visit. And I think what I recall most is that there was I would see this permanent kind of Inuit art collection, but I didn't really see much in terms of, contemporary Indigenous art at that time.
And now it's better?
Well, now it's so much better, thanks to many people, including Wanda. So I think it's for example, not long ago I went into the into the galleries upstairs, and I saw a huge Shelley Nero light box installation, photos, and I was really, really impressed that it was so at the front and kind of in your face.
Well, let's take a look at a couple of pieces that are featured in your exhibition called Facing the Monumental at the AGO. And if you can tell us a little bit about what inspired them. Now, the first piece we're looking at is called Rising to the Occasion. Can you please tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, that was like a work I did in 1987. I had left art school in Toronto here and had gone home to Thunder Bay. And in 1987, the royal family, members of the royal family, came on a visit to Thunder Bay to visit the rebuilt or fake historic fort, old Fort William. And it's pretty funny because they landed in the city. They were only there for like half a day, but they were at the airport, taken up the road, up the highway, put into a birch bark canoe, and then they were canoed down to the fort on the Kaministiquia River, and they disembarked on the wharf. So basically, they were reenacting colonial history and the fur trading history. So I made this gown, which is Rising to the Occasion, and it's part royal ball gown and part beaver dam.
And what are you trying to say with that piece?
Well, I was just trying to, think about what to wear for this event, even though I wasn't at the fort, but I took part in a performance piece, which we thought of as a protest. So this woman, Lynn Sharman, organized this parade on the main street, on the main drag in downtown Port Arthur.
It's called 12 Angry Crinolines.
12 Angry Crinolines, yes. And so I made the dress, and as the only First Nations woman in the show, I got to be the first lady and lead the parade. So that was kind of cute.
Which is significant. That must have meant a lot for you.
Well, it was actually crazy because all the garments that the 12 women had made were all kind of, outrageous and funny and at the same time serious. So it was just it was kind of a good time and interesting that a lot of people were offended by what we did in the community.
Why would they be offended?
Because they were royalists and they didn't like that we were poking fun at this visit.
The next piece we're taking a look at is Blood on the Snow. Can you walk us through this piece?
Wanda, can you take over for a little bit?
Yeah, Blood on the Snow comes out of the thinking about the Wounded Knee Massacre in 1890. So that it was the kind of scene is the cavalry came in, and a large part of the massacre were women and children that were murdered, and they were frozen in the snow, and they were found days later. And then Rebecca looked at this work or looked at that kind of event and thought about it, but from a very different point of view, didn't replicate the event.
Yeah, I was just thinking about how snow has, as Canadians, everyone is well aware of how snow can really deaden the sound. So I think, I wanted to think about how it must have been after, like when the bodies of women and children and the people were frozen in the snow, and how that must have been deafeningly, silent, very quiet.
The single chair is eerie in a way. What are you saying by having a chair there?
Well, I think I've used chairs in several other works over the years, but in this work, I was interested in thinking about the chair as being empty, and that perhaps there had been someone there who had witnessed this event. So I think, at the same time, if you think about chairs, chairs are something that we would not have had, before colonialism.
The third piece I'd like to take a look at is titled 1181.
Yes.
Can you tell us about this piece, please?
What year did I make this, Wanda?
It was 2014. We were doing an exhibition together called Quay.
Yes.
And so
I was invited to make a performance piece for my show at the Justine Barnaky Gallery at U of T. And so what I decided to do was to take a look at the RCMP report that had come out around that same time, where they had determined that the number of murdered and missing women was 1,181. So what I proposed to do was to work outside the gallery. And so what we did is Wanda was there with me, and we went looking for a piece of tree trunk. And we managed to find this amazing piece of wood in Trinity Bellwoods Park. It was kind of abandoned there and sitting in a kind of in a ditch.
I don't know if this is my eyes tricking me, but it kind of looks like a woman's torso.
It does, it does look.
Was that intentional? Or?
It was like, I think it was a gift, really, because I wasn't looking for anything specific, but I was looking for something of a certain size. And it's quite, ironic to me that it turned out to resemble a torso.
Of a woman, yeah.
And what were you trying to say with that piece?
I set myself up outside the gallery, which was right next door to, or very close by, was there was a group of men, construction workers, building something. So I was, 20 feet away from them, building something myself, and I was wearing like a work vest that has an X mark on the back, like a safety vest. And so I just proceeded to, over the course of the day, hammer 1,181 nails into the piece, into the wood, and creating this sculptural object.
And by the end of the performance, because it went on for hours, there was about 700 people gathered because there was a women's studies conference on at the same time, so they all came out to it. And when she was done, you yelled out 1,181, and the whole crowd just went silent. And then she left, she walked out, and nobody moved for 30 minutes. They just stared at this sculpture. And then slowly people got up on their own to run their hand above the nails. And you could kind of feel this energy coming off of it. It was quite profound.
And let's talk about it now, because I was going to talk about it later. But having witnesses, having people see the work that you're doing, how is that a part? What does that add to the art that you're creating?
Well, I think my approach to performance is generally that I create something in front of people. So I make art in front of people. And so I'm just interested in having people experience this process of working. At least I think we're all fascinated by watching people work.
We're showing a video clip from Toronto's Nuit Blanche in 2016, where you spent 12 hours at the AGO creating an experience entitled Clay on Stone.
Yes.
You use different mediums. You use wood, you use clay, you use photography. How do you decide which medium you're going to use to tell the art that you're creating?
Well, that's a big question, but I think it's just really a matter of trying to figure out how to what material best articulates my idea, and I think in this performance at the AGO, for example, I think people could relate to the tactile quality and of wet clay, and this idea of rubbing it onto stone. So I think I try to use materials and gestures that people can easily relate to. So that way, I think that's a way of communicating with someone without speaking to them.
And what informs your viewpoint as an artist?
I make work from my experience as a human being. So I happen to be, Anishinaabe from Northwestern Ontario. So my work, I would say, comes from that point of view. But at the same time, I hope that the work is open enough and not so specific to my identity, my Indigenous identity, that other people from other cultures can relate to it.
You've been called an Indigenous artist. What is your response being labeled as one?
I am an Anishinaabe artist. So that's very specific. Wanda?
I think there was a time when these kinds of labels maybe seemed constricting, but I think now what part of me could you cut off that would take the Aboriginal or the Indigenous or the whatever out of what I do, right? So I think you can't separate being an Anishinaabe from being an artist, but at the same time, doesn't tell you the whole story.
Would you
either.
just prefer being called an artist, or do you think that we would
have
label things?
No, I have no problem being called an Anishinaabe artist, and I think it's important because so much of our history has been erased. So I think I feel very happy to know that there are more and more Indigenous artists entering the field of contemporary art, and I think we are kind of reasserting our identities and creating new identities. So I think it's great to be part of that movement that I see happening with the youth in this country.
And Wanda, when Canadians hear the phrase Indigenous art, I think they probably think of someone as like Norval Morrisseau, who's painting Medicine Bear we can see here. How accurate or inaccurate would you say our perception of Indigenous art is?
I think that it's probably not terribly accurate in some ways. I think that we've really expanded what is considered Indigenous art. So now, it just means that you're an Indigenous person making art. So it doesn't have to look Indigenous, which was the constraint for so long. So I think Morrisseau was amazing because he broke new ground, right? He put some of our ancient some of the oldest imagery that exists in this country, the oldest art forms, and put them in paint and on birch bark, and really brought that to a very wide audience and shook up the art world quite a bit, and opened doors. Him and Daphne Ojig and Alex Janvier, all these painters. And then you have artists like Rebecca Belmore and Robert Houle and Faye Heavyshield, and they come next, and they really shake up our idea of what Indigenous art can look like and what kind of mediums it can exist in.
If I may add,
of course,
I first met Norval Morrisseau in, I believe it was 1981, before I decided to go to art school, and I felt that he was an extremely powerful human being, and I had great respect for his presence as just the way he held himself, and I know that he was a very committed artist and extremely talented.
Do you have anyone else that influenced you on becoming an artist, or is this something that you always wanted to do?
I think that I was always kind of good at it, if I may say so myself.
Yes, you're right. You have an exhibit at the AGO. You're probably better than just good.
I think that gravitating towards the arts was natural for me, and I think it was a way for me to try to come to terms with, being Indigenous in this country and all that, what comes with all that. So I think for me it was a way to maneuver and to kind of go out in the world and protect myself, and at the same time say things that I wanted to say.
You also use photography as part of your toolkit as a visual artist. How does photography fit into your art?
Well, I'm not a photographer myself, so I work with photographers. And basically, I kind of take maybe, loosely, this is generality. I might take things that are present in my performance work and kind of push them into the medium of photography.
And we're taking a look at this piece. Can you tell us about those two pieces?
The first was Sister, which was made for 2010 during the Olympic Games in Vancouver. And the work was situated on Hastings Street in downtown east side of Vancouver. And it was on February 14th, there's a Women's March annually. And so I knew that these women would walk past this image, which was installed in the window.
And the other one is State of Grace. And those are they're strips of paper, right?
Yes.
What are you saying with that?
Well, it's a photograph that has been shredded. So I've cut it into these strips so that it will, when it's in the space, it kind of moves because of if you pass by it or the natural current in the space. So basically, the sleeping figure in that's depicted in the photograph is still breathing. So she's just resting.
If you think about the way that you use your own body in performance art, and she has this presence that is quite intense and super strong. And I think the same thing translates into your photography in terms of Sister being this woman with her arms out and ready to fly. And State of Grace is also, the state of grace that women also hold.
Wanda, last fall, it was reported that Canada's national funding body for the arts, the Canada Council for the Arts, took a stance against cultural appropriation, announcing it's implementing a new system for assessing projects that include elements of Indigenous culture. Artists and organizations seeking funding from the council will be assessed according to a new framework, requiring applicants to prove their work aligns with the council's commitment to respect and honor the rights of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples to cultural sovereignty. Do you see this as a positive step in what they're doing?
I think it could be a positive step. I think it's a positive step in terms of making a statement about the cultural sovereignty of Indigenous people and placing that on the agenda and to say that this is something important. I think they've been dealing with a lot of kind of cultural appropriation coming out in the last few years in certain kinds of projects and have no way of really saying that, right, on the jury or in the room. So I think this is also a way to set a policy for the whole, for the kind of the arts happening in Canada. I know at the AGO, that's what we've been doing is sort of putting the kind of nation to nation relationship forward and kind of saying, okay, this is our value system. And so I think stating that as a value is a good thing.
And what about artists? Like Rebecca, what responsibility does any artist have to consider the issue of cultural appropriation?
Well, I think it's really up to the individual, to the person, to the human being, to decide what is not theirs. Maybe, I think that's how I operate. I as an Indigenous.
So you wouldn't be offended if a non-Indigenous artist did use Indigenous art?
I might be offended, but I wouldn't tell them what to do. So I think it's really, that's how I operate myself. I decide what I'm comfortable with. And I think that's really the responsibility of the artist.
In an article for Canadian Art, Leanne Martin described your work this way. She writes, usually site-specific and often based upon immediate experience, Belmore's mixed media installations expand upon traditional notions of sculpture. Her relationship to place and history, identity, and circumstance is central to her multidisciplinary practice. How well does your work, for instance, your piece Facing the Monumental, translate from site-specific to being witnessed in a gallery setting?
Well, I think the performance took place at Queen's Park here in Toronto, and it was a live event. So when I take something out of its original setting and put it into the museum, of course it's no longer what it was. So, but I think taking the title Facing the Monumental for this exhibition really speaks about my concern for the future, not just for Indigenous people, but for all people.
Everybody.
Yes.
And in the press release for the AGO's exhibition, Wanda, you wrote, Belmore's images are deeply felt and leave an indelible mark on the viewer. In capturing the universal truths of pain, beauty, empathy, hope, and transformation, her work positions the viewer as a witness and encourages us all to face what is monumental. What did you mean by that?
Obviously, I meant a lot of things, but Rebecca and I were having a conversation about the role of artists and art, especially today. We're facing like an environmental crisis. There are wars starting all over the world right now. There's a growth in fascism and racism. And it was just sort of for me, I was thinking about artists who kind of face that in their work, and they do it in a way that is, more poetic and in a different, it's not meant to teach people what to do about that, but it's a way for us to look at our humanity, to look at who we are, to look at the world in a deep way. And that kind of leads us somewhere else.
We're going to take a look at a couple of still images from Rebecca's piece entitled Fountain. Tell me about how you perceive that water has played a role in Rebecca's work, Wanda.
Fountain being so much ahead of its time in terms of thinking about water, and the fact that water is for me, it's the most important issue of our day today. I was involved with the I Don't Know More movement precisely because it was about water, and that water is this resource that is our life. It's the life of our earth. It's our our life, and to think that it is going to be scarce, or to think that it's being polluted, or to think that it's turned into a commodity that you can buy off the shelf. All of these things have sort of are what Rebecca was thinking about long before a lot of people were thinking about that.
And what year was that?
2005.
2005. What's it like for you as an artist to see a retrospective of your work?
I think it's extremely weird. But it's it's interesting to look at all the work together in one spot, and to see myself aging, and maybe seeing a younger self that was maybe more rambunctious or a little bit crazier. And I think now, mellowing into something mature, but still not losing my edge, hopefully.
I know it's kind of, I probably shouldn't ask this question, but I have to. I think it's probably like asking someone to name their favorite child or favorite, person in the world. But looking back at your work, what do you think is your most definitive piece? What's your favorite piece? Or that says everything that you want to say?
Well, I don't think there is one piece, but I think I have a favorite piece might be the early work that the AGO purchased, Rising to the Occasion, because I think I continually, as an artist, and I think all artists, we have to rise to the occasion. Not only, where we find ourselves, situated in the world at a particular time in space, but also to, rise to the occasion and challenge yourself to continue making work. And, you always have to look forward and not backwards. So I don't really look back at my work, even though this exhibition is kind of making that happen.
But the majority is actually new work, so
that's true.
In a way, we're still looking forward.
You're still building. In the video that we showed earlier, we saw people taking photographs of your work as it was being performed. Is that a valid part of being a witness to your work?
Absolutely. I'm not concerned about people taking pictures, or with one exception.
What's the one exception?
Was the 1,181. So, but I generally don't pay attention to that, and I think it's good if people post images, and that adds to the conversation, I hope.
And why did you not want someone to take a picture of you while you were doing 1,000?
Because I was wanting it to be much more intimate, and like more like a meditative kind of
to be in the moment.
Space, yeah, to quietly, make a work over the period of one day.
And Wanda, what do you hope people take from this exhibit?
I hope that they come in just open, experience the work, feel the work, let it inside, let it do its thing, and see where it takes them later. Because I think some of the images that she creates stick with you, and you contemplate them later, and they're quite rich in that sense. So, yeah, I think I just want them to come open and experience it.
And we've got 20 seconds. Rebecca, what do you hope they take away from the experience?
I just hope they are open-minded and try to make sense of it. So it's pretty simple. I make the work and put it out there, and the work has to deal with it, defend itself or be there by itself. So
do you get nervous people seeing your work?
No, not at all.
That's why you create it.
That's right. I don't make it to hide it in my basement.
Final question. Rebecca, Wanda, thank you so much for being here, and congratulations on the exhibition.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
So the protests at Wet'suwet'en bear witness to ongoing debates regarding Indigenous sovereignty, claims to land, and finally, really basic claims to humanity. The recognition of the Wet'suwet'en nation is also about the recognition of Indigenous peoples as people who are not under colonial rule, and who cannot be racialized in deeply violent hierarchies that involve white settler control over Indigenous peoples, their lives, their money, and land. So I will finish with this question. What does decolonization require? So that is the lecture for this week. I'll also post another lecture about the murder of Neil Stonechild as well, which also discusses Indigenous issues in Canada or Turtle Island. Thank you. Goodbye.